So Mary and Joseph took Jesus to the temple to offer the sacrifice required by the law of Moses, and so the story continues. And Luke writes that as they came to the temple to fulfill this requirement, an elderly man was there waiting, a resident of Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. He was a very good man, a lover of God who kept himself pure, and the spirit of holiness rested upon him. Simeon believed in the imminent appearing of the one called the Refreshing of Israel, for the Holy Spirit had revealed to him that he would not see death before he saw the Messiah, the Anointed One of God. And for this reason, the Holy Spirit had moved him to be in the temple court at the very moment Jesus' parents entered to fulfill the requirement of the sacrifice. Now, for me, this story is such a vivid illustration at such a personal level of how God's Spirit moves in people to place them in exactly the right place on the right day at the right time as they listen and obey Him. Don't you just love how God lined everything up? As Mary and Joseph moved in obedience to the law, and Simeon moved in sensitivity to the Holy Spirit, God moved each of them into place, and His wonderful plan unfolded. And I find this so encouraging. It's not up to us to orchestrate things. We don't have to make God's plan unfold. We just have to listen and obey, and He orchestrates the pieces to fall into place. And I remember when we saw God do this in our family. We homeschooled our kids for 5 years, which, to be really honest, was one of the hardest seasons of my life, mainly because I did most of the schooling and I simply had no idea what I was doing. I have to confess that most of the time I seriously worried that I was messing up their education for life. But every time we went back to the Lord, my husband and I just had this deep sense that we were to continue. But it felt like 5 years of walking on water, and most of the time I was terrified that I was sinking. Thank goodness for my level-headed husband. And right towards the end of that season, we were advised to take one of our children to a specialist because there were some concerns that this particular child might need some additional support. And after we'd had the assessment, the specialist rang me and said, listen, I don't normally speak to clients. A written report is usually enough, but I just personally really wanted to speak to you. Because you see, I've never seen anything like this before. I totally understand why you were sent to me, because watching your child, I would expect them to test positive for the condition. But on every test, your child registers in the totally normal range. Now, I know you've homeschooled, so may I ask, what have you done with your child for the last 5 years? And I responded, well, not much really. I've actually spent most of my time worrying that I wasn't doing enough. And this lady said to me, but what about sport? Have they been very active? And I said, well, yes, I suppose if you count running around barefoot and jumping on trampolines as sport, they've done a lot of that. They're hopeless at sitting still. And she exclaimed, that's it. That's what's done it. That's why your child doesn't have the problems we would expect to see presented. Because your child wasn't locked behind a desk, but was allowed to be so physical and jumped on a trampoline so much, the brain had time to fix itself. In other words, the Lord had gone before us and without us having a clue, had created an environment that corrected a problem we didn't even know existed. We just listened and obeyed, and He orchestrated the pieces to fall into place. Let's be reminded of the story again. Jesus' parents came to the temple to fulfill the requirement of the law, and Simeon was there waiting. Simeon was a very good man who loved God and was waiting expectantly for the Messiah. And Luke writes that for this reason, the Holy Spirit had moved him to be in the temple court at the very moment Jesus' parents entered to fulfill the requirement of the sacrifice. Holy Spirit, would you grow us into people who, just like Simeon, listen and obey, that we might have the privilege of seeing your kingdom unfold around us. Amen.